Welcome to another edition of the Keep Africa Trading Podcast. This podcast is part of TradeMark Africa's initiative to drive conversations and discussions around trade in Africa at scale. So Susan, karibu sana.
Thank you very much.
So maybe you can introduce yourself, your role and what it is that you do.
Okay, so I'm a board member for TradeMark Africa. I currently sit as the vice chair and I head the HR committee of the board.
Oh, wow. Okay.
Yes.
And I presume you have an HR background.
So I have an HR background. That's what I've done. That has been my profession and career. Very blessed to do something I've loved over the course of my career. Yes.
Fantastic, fantastic. So I'd like to sort of maybe start off by the theme of this conference, which is digital trade. And I think there's a very interesting aspect to that and the concept of course, HR and, what you do at TradeMark as a director there. But more importantly, what are your thoughts around digital trade and what it means for Africa?
Well, there are many different aspects of digital trade, but overall, the way I would sum it up is it is the future. And the benefit Africa will have is to leapfrog, to in one way go ahead and not have to go through the very many stages different areas of the world have gone through. And so you can learn from that. On the other hand, I think there will be some negatives of not going through the paces and learning from each stage. But I think the future for Africa has to be digital. The population in Africa is growing up in a digital age, and so that becomes their natural future. Although, again, one of the challenges, and one of our directors mentioned it, is that you don't want to have a part of the population that is digital, who are digital natives, taking the advantage and leaving others behind. And also the economics of the African population, very stratified. You have very few people who have high level of income and therefore a wide level of access. You have a large population that has a lower level of income, probably a lower level of access. You have inequality in the infrastructure. So we have to make sure that digital doesn't come and further divide the continent. But overall, with all those challenges, I think digital, in terms of Africa, in terms of trade, in terms of all the other aspects, is our future.
Now, one of the things that came out very strongly, I think, throughout the theme of this conference was, I think, the youth of Africa. The fact that I think another 20 years, I think 1 in 5 people on the planet is going to be African. But more importantly, the fact that we are young.
Yes.
And I'm just wondering, from your perspective, given your HR background, what do you think that means in terms of the digital context, but broadly, what opportunities that open up for Africa when it comes to trade?
One, if you have a population that will grow up as digital natives, borders disappear. And so this view of Africa as, 52 separate countries sort of takes the back seat to the fact that we become Africans and we can talk to each other. And we already have a generation that is talking to the world without borders. And so for them to have this mindset that we are one continent, we can have intercontinental trade, becomes something that they don't need to change their minds to. However, we do have other generations who are still here, who even trading beyond their own county, is something of a struggle, either because it's not something that they've been socialized with, they've grown up to, or they have information about. So it's about how do we balance those two, one generation that sees the world as their playground, and therefore Africa being one part of that world, and others who do not have the information or the visibility of what's, just across in the other county and what opportunities there are to trade. Those two, I think, differences, extremes, provide huge opportunities. So if I'm in one county into the next, and I'm aware of what the opportunities are, it changes how I see myself, what I produce, what I need to purchase, where I can purchase it from, and therefore my world of trade becomes a little bit bigger. When I move it to a digital platform, I take that expanded mindset and then I apply it to however far my digital landscape takes me. So there's an immense opportunity for trade in that way.
Now, one of the earlier conversations that I had here, and it's so interesting because I'm looking at your dress, which I really like.
Thank you.
And it looks possibly West African.
Yes.
And I shared an anecdote where a friend of mine, there's a function and she was wearing this incredible garment. And I immediately asked her, I like African clothes as well. Can you share the contact with me? She got it in Accra. Her work takes her to Accra regularly. So she has a guy on the ground who has these clothes. I went to the website. I saw the clothes. I tried to buy. I could not buy. It started to feel like, I think the cost of getting that 2 shirts, whatever, from there to here, when I tried to figure it all out, it seemed like it was going to be more hassle than possibly asking her, when you're back there, just make sure you get a couple of double XLs and bring them for me. And I'm coming back again to this question of the youth and digitization and all this, but how do we start doing this? How does TradeMark see this sort of closing that gap so that if you have the intent and the desire to buy from other African markets, from other young traders, for instance, how do we start closing that gap through digital trade?
I think you need to involve all the stakeholders involved in that value chain. Let's just talk about the shirt. So you have seen an opportunity to buy a product in West Africa and want it shipped back into Kenya and you want it to be available. If you take the Amazon story of the American continent and they do the same thing, it's just they're one country. They can ship a product, or even in Kenya, you can buy, if that product was in America, easier than when it is in Ghana. So the regulations and the agreements among stakeholders have to open up to allow that trade to happen. So that's one part. And we do have the Africa Continental Free Trade Agreements that are working towards that. I have a slightly different point of view, having come from private sector. There is a way in which private sector, when it makes sense and they are able to, make things happen. So either whether that's going back to government and saying you are curtailing our opportunity to expand. So can you make this happen and apply the right kind of pressure in the right kind of places to then open up commerce? It also is an opportunity for young voices to say this is our future and this is what we want to build our futures on. So can you pave the way or put people into positions that understand that this is the future that they want? And therefore, how do we make these regulations work? It's also sitting with government and asking them, what are your concerns? What are your fears? And somebody brought it up about VAT. So when you buy a garment, VAT is usually charged at the point of sale. But the consumer is in a different country, in a different tax jurisdiction. So how do we manage that if that is one of the fears of government? And so I think there's a point of articulating what these fears are, bringing clarity, because when you're clear about the problem, you can solve it.
Yeah.
And I think we have demonstrated that in many spheres. Yeah.
Yeah, and I think as we think about sort of, how to sort of remove those barriers and all, I think another conversation that came up is this, perspective around the fact that in Africa we have these 50-something countries, and then each one is sort of being a bit protectionist about the economy. And really the opportunity here is to see ourselves not as one country, but as regions, perhaps, at the very least.
Yes.
And say, within the East African region, how do we remove all these barriers so that net, the trading opportunities are massive? And of course, this is something that governments and regulations and policies have to do. But how do we, catalyze that? And I imagine those are sort of things that TradeMark sort of brings to the table and is helping, bridge those gaps. But how do we make that work?
I see the work TradeMark does in terms of TradeMark works at Africa continental level, it works in the regional level, it works at country level, and it works at small trader level. In those spheres, I think there's a lot more information that we can share, visibility that we can bring to the conversations and what is happening and what the challenges are at each level. So there's a lot more communication, awareness, that needs to be built in terms of what is already happening, because there are things that are happening, and sometimes we overlook that to see what is not happening. So how do we promote what is happening and allow a lot more people to join into those platforms, into those conversations, and into those arrangements? The other thing I see TradeMark doing is if we can catalyze enough movements at community levels, and get then the communities to see that the economics of what they're doing works, and have that start creating a ripple effect. I think that, to me, would be the fastest catalyst. Because if you would have a lot of these communities start realizing, and I think it's a gentleman from UN, I can't remember which body of the UN, was talking about the economics of peace and prosperity. So what is in it for me is what I get economically. And if my economic prosperity is reliant on peace with my neighbor, then that becomes also a new avenue that I then say, okay, because I'm economically tied to my neighbor, and therefore I must be at peace with my neighbor because I'm having conversations and trade with my neighbor. And then how does that spread? Because sometimes it's very hard to make change, singular change, at the top. It's easier to have these micro levels of singular change, and then let the communities also buy in, because this is their future. There is only so much you would do as an organization coming in to provide and to show. And then when people pick this up, I think that's what will catalyze this forward.
Again, I want to run back to maybe, given your background, you know, HR, talent, and I think this is a very important question or perspective you brought to my mind here, which was thinking about the younger generations being much more comfortable with technology and digital platforms. Older people, what we call the digital immigrants, struggling with that transition. And of course, this is now becoming our new normal, as it were, you know, digital trade. How do you see, particularly for the older segments, how do they start to play in these areas? And maybe are there any initiatives and activities that maybe TradeMark is supporting to ensure that there's maybe knowledge transfer, possibly training, capacity building? How do we make sure that they too, because of their age and less familiarity with technology, are not left behind?
It's programs that allow people to understand and be aware, but also to use. I think the more people use the technology or use more technology enabled tools, the easier it will become. And I don't know if it will be a complete transition. In organizations, many organizations are reskilling and retooling to accommodate AI.
Yes.
And so if that's happening even in the formal sector, which is usually the engine that drives private sector growth, it means it has to happen across the economies, across all levels of the economy. So reskilling, retooling is important. One of the things I have observed and reflected on in this conference is that we're talking about digital trade, and maybe we didn't have the right balance of digital natives here to speak about what they see as the future. From their perspective of we already live in this world, and that could be something I think we can add flavor to next time. There is also maybe something of a reverse learning where those of us who are older and more seasoned in our lives need to learn from those who are younger in terms of how they work, how they learn, how they engage, how they socialize on these digital platforms. There are lessons we could learn about how it could help our lives and how our engagements, and therefore our trade. There are lessons they could learn about the world is not only digital. So how do you then build the social skills outside the platforms to engage when you eventually do meet your customers?
That's so true.
Yes. So I think there's a level of, you know, both sets of digital immigrants and digital natives can learn to exchange. It will be a cultural shift from how, for example, I was raised. You don't, you know, speak up to your elders. You just listen to what they say. However, there's a lot they can teach us. There's a lot our children and the next generation can teach us about how they live and they cope in this digital world and how it helps them engage, and therefore how it will help them trade and engage in the future. But also their social skills, I think they still need to balance that. Not everything will be online. Yeah.
And then I think another thing that comes to mind as we have this conversation, again, thinking back to the people factor, as it were, you know, I'm thinking also around, you know, I have this phrase I always like to say or reuse. I say people sometimes don't know what they don't know. And in the conversations we've been having actually as part of this series of podcasts is I've spoken to a lot of people telling me things about trade happening in Kenya and East Africa and eye-popping numbers, garment exports and things like this. What are your thoughts around what are the means and ways that we can sort of start to share this narrative from TradeMark about the things that are happening? Because my sense is that there sometimes feels like there's a very negative narrative around Africa. Things are not working, things are not happening. The kids are breaking parliament, whatever it is. But the point is, there also seems to be a lot of positive stories, things that are so inspiring. You're almost like, why, maybe I should shift what I'm doing and doing what this guy is doing, So I don't know what your thoughts are around that, because there seems to be a completely different narrative I've heard here.
Yes.
Than what has been generally circulating around the trade and export opportunities and so forth, the businesses I've met, the people I've interviewed. So what are your thoughts around that? Because I feel like there's a much bigger story here.
I think we need to own our own narrative as Africans. And I heard Akon say this once. And for me, it was a complete shift because I knew him as a musician. But when he started speaking and was speaking about Africa and the African story, and the African story must be told by Africans, we need to elevate the things that we have done, the successes we have. Because I had the opportunity to work for Safaricom when we were doing M-Pesa. And as great as M-Pesa is and as changing, as big of a change as it was, it is not the only story. But when you look for African stories about, innovation, it's always M-Pesa. And I think there's a time now that we need to say, yes, M-Pesa was phenomenal when it happened. And the possibilities that it has brought to market. What next? What happened since? And going to find the stories. And understanding maybe why some of those who have had the successes may be a little bit reticent about sharing them. So, and what is the concern there? Because once you see something and you can emulate, it's easier to follow.
Yes.
It's easier to say, okay, so somebody's done this before. What learnings are there? What path did you take that maybe, what steps can we skip? Because you're the trailblazer and, you've cut this path for us to follow. So there are a lot of stories. And I think it's one of the areas TradeMark will pick up in terms of how do we share a lot more. We operate in 14 countries, or we're present in 14 countries. We operate in 20 countries on the continent. There's a lot of stories there. There's a lot more we could elevate and celebrate, and then allow people to come in and join. Yeah.
So as we're coming to the end of our conversation, I'm thinking now in the context of two things. One is, when it comes to TradeMark as a whole, and what you're doing across the African continent, what are the things that we can expect and look forward to in the next, 5 to 10 years? And then secondly, from you at a personal level, I'd like to maybe understand, what is it that motivates you or inspires you, or, is your passion around what you do with TradeMark and the impact it has across the African continent?
Okay. So what can you expect from TradeMark? So we have learned a lot of lessons in East Africa and maybe Eastern Southern Africa. We are now moving across to West Africa. So one of the things you can expect from TradeMark is a continental approach to making a difference, to uniting East and West from the work that we have done and the engagements we intend to do. So that's one big expansion. The second area is we're going into green trade and understanding how do we capitalize and execute green trade because of the effects that we've seen in climate and other areas. And those adversely affect probably Africa. I heard today that 60% of the arable land in the world is in Africa.
Wow.
Yes. So when you hear statistics like this and know that we are an agriculturally based continent, then climate and green become a bigger issue than probably what it's understood to be. So I think those are some of the areas. And then just execution. How do we then make the changes in Africa that will support and facilitate and catalyze those changes that really open up trade?
Fantastic.
Yes. From a personal perspective, what do I see? I love the African story. We're Africans. And I like the fact that we can move away from, yes, we live in different regions. We identify with different nationalities, but we're African. And this is time for the African story. So any difference I can make to opening that up and helping people take 2-3 steps forward, then that's worth waking up for.
Wow, I think that's the right note to end this.
Thank
you so much for this conversation and those perspectives. Definitely looking forward to seeing more about what TradeMark is going to be doing across the board, and wishing you all the best in all that you're doing with TradeMark.
Thank you very much. It was a pleasure to be here.
So there you have it. Thank you so much for joining us for this conversation with Susan coming from TradeMark Africa as one of the directors there. But more importantly, I think she shared some really interesting perspectives about bridging that gap between our digital natives and immigrants in the context of digital trade across the African continent. My name is Moses Kemibaro. I'm the host of this podcast today, Keeping Africa Trading on the TradeMark Africa podcast. Thank you so much for joining us today, and we hope to catch you in more conversations.